Hello, my name is Michael Lenahan, and today's message is titled The Pentateuch, Foundations That Still Shape Our Faith. When many believers hear the Pentateuch, they immediately think of ancient laws, long genealogies, or stories that feel far removed from everyday life. As a result, these 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are often skimmed, avoided, or treated as background material for the more important parts of the Bible. Yet the Pentateuch forms the theological backbone of all Scripture. Every major biblical theme, creation, sin, covenant, redemption, sacrifice, holiness, and promise begins here. Jesus himself consistently referenced these books and assumed their authority and reverence. If we want to understand the gospel clearly, we must first understand the foundation it is still built upon. The Pentateuch is not merely about what happened long ago. It reveals timeless truths about God, humanity, and what it means to walk by faith. To understand why these books still matter today, we must begin by seeing what the Pentateuch teaches us about the nature of character of God. And that brings us to point number 1. The Pentateuch reveals the character of God. Let me say that again. Point number 1 today is the Pentateuch reveals the character of God. From the opening verse in Genesis, God is revealed as creator, powerful, intentional, and good. Creation is orderly and purposeful, reflecting a God who brings life and meaning rather than chaos. Humanity is made in God's image, establishing dignity, value, and responsibility. As the story progresses, we see that this same God is deeply relational. After sin enters the world, God pursues humanity rather than abandoning them. He calls Abraham, makes promises, and initiates covenants. In Exodus, God reveals himself as a deliverer who hears the cries of his people and acts decisively to rescue them from slavery. In Leviticus, God reveals his holiness and his desire to dwell among his people. The sacrificial system teaches that sin is serious, but access to God is possible through atonement. In Numbers, we see God's patience as he continues to guide a complaining and rebellious people. Finally, in Deuteronomy, God is portrayed as faithful, reminding Israel of his past actions and calling them to trust him as they move forward. The Pentateuch represents a God who is both holy and gracious, just and merciful. This balanced picture protects us from creating a distorted view of God, one that emphasizes love without holiness or holiness without grace. Once we understand who God is, the next logical question is, how are God's redeemed people supposed to live in a response to him? Brings us to point number 2. The Pentateuch teaches us how God's people are to live. Let me say that again. Our second point today is the Pentateuch teaches us how God's people are to live. A common misconception is that the Pentateuch is primarily about rules and restrictions. In reality, the narrative shows that God saves first and instructs second. Israel is delivered from Egypt before the law is given at the Mount Sinai. Obedience flows from relationship, not the other way around. The law in the Pentateuch shapes Israel into a distinct people who reflects God's character. They address worship, justice, compassion, community life, and personal responsibility. God cares about how his people treat the poor, the foreigner, the vulnerable, and one another. These instructions reveal that faith is not confined to religious moments, but impacts everyday life. For believers today, the Pentateuch helps us understand the depth of sin, the need for holiness, and the cost of forgiveness. The sacrificial system prepares us to grasp the significance of Christ's ultimate sacrifice. Without the Pentateuch, the New Testament loses much of its meaning and weight. Studying these books also teaches us how to read Scripture faithfully by paying attention to context, genre, and God's unfolding plan of redemption. Alongside the law and commands, the Pentateuch also gives us real people whose lives illustrate what faith looks like in practice. One of the most important of these is Abraham, and that brings us to our third point today. Abraham teaches us what living faith looks like. Let me say that again. Abraham teaches us what living faith looks like. That's our third point. Abraham's story begins with the divine call that requires trust and surrender. God calls him to leave his homeland, family, and security without giving him all the details. Abraham's obedience is rooted not in certainty, but in faith in God's promise. Throughout Abraham's life, we see both obedience and failure. He trusts God enough to follow him, yet he also struggles with fear and doubt. He tries to take matters into his own hands, yet God remains faithful to his covenant. This reminds us that faith is a journey marked by growth, not perfection. Abraham's life teaches us that faith involves waiting, trusting, and believing God even when circumstances seem uncertain. His willingness to trust God with the promise, even with Isaac, demonstrates a faith that rests in God's character rather than in human understanding. For us today, Abraham models a faith that listens to God's call, responds in obedience, and trusts God's timing. And so, in conclusion today, the Pentateuch is not outdated or irrelevant. It is foundational to our faith. These 5 books reveal who God is, how his people are called to live, and what genuine faith looks like in action. They provide the framework that helps us understand the gospel and the redemptive work of Christ. When we take time to study the Pentateuch, we grow in theological depth, biblical literacy, and spiritual maturity. Like Abraham, we are called to trust God's promises, walk forward in obedience, and believe that God, who was faithful then, is still faithful today. Understanding the Pentateuch does not lead us away from Christ. It leads us more deeply to him.